Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada, the show where we talk about cultural items, history, politics, society, and everything in between in this snowy land that we currently call Canada. I'm actually re-recording this intro because I felt that the original intro that I recorded was a bit abrupt, but today I'm talking to Professor Emeritus Thomas Pedersen about his brand new book, The Carbon Tax Question. Obviously, before we get into it, I highly encourage people to check out Pedersen's work, and if they want to support this particular show, you can also find links in the description, as well as a link to find Thomas's book. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
I'm here today with Thomas Pedersen, who wrote recently a book known as The Carbon Tax Question, and we're here to talk about it. So, Thomas, I always like to start with all of my author interviews with the exact same question, and that is, can you explain the book to a layman who may or may not have heard of what this book actually is about?
Yes, well, the title of the book is The Carbon Tax Question, and the subtitle is Clarifying Canada's Most Consequential Policy Debate. And what the book describes really is, the book is asking and answering a question. Why, of all places in the world, did British Columbia, the small province of British Columbia, bring in the world's first broad spectrum, revenue neutral, gently accelerating carbon tax, using the word tax, in 2008? What were the political influences at the time? What kind of leadership did we enjoy at the time? Why was there a sentiment growing in British Columbia that we had to act on the global warming challenge via the pathway of a carbon tax? And I use that word tax very directly here. We did not shy away in this province from the word tax. And in fact, what happened was when we asked that question, why did it happen? Well, when I started to reflect on this, I retired from the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions that I directed at the University of Victoria. When I retired from that, going back now to 2017, I simply asked, why is the story not out there? Why don't people appreciate how difficult it was to bring into place a revenue neutral carbon tax under a conservative government? And I think that's a point that we really need to reinforce. It was a conservative government brought it in. Where is that story being, where has it been? And it turns out it had not been told. There were a few academic publications on the success of the tax and so on, and its structure, but there was nothing available that explored the political history, what was going on in the back rooms, what the thinking was of the key players, and the key players were actually a small number of human beings, a small number of politicians. What was the thinking of the business community? What was the response of the public? And so on. And so I sat down and thought, well, I'm going to write that book. Now, that was in 2017 when I started. I had not anticipated at all that it would become a political hot potato. In fact, I thought, I'll write this book, and if I'm lucky, maybe my daughter will buy a copy, and that will be it. I really did not anticipate any interest in the topic at all, but I did feel an obligation to try and get the story into the historical record so that in future people can look back and say, oh, now we understand how and why British Columbia did what it did. And then I added one little wrinkle to it. it's such a story of success. It really is a remarkable success story. Our tax really worked extraordinarily well here. But I wanted to compare it to somewhere where there was failure. And so I looked around the world to try and find the best example of failure of a carbon pricing scheme or a carbon tax. That happened to be Australia. So in 2017, I went to Australia for 3 months. I was resident at the University of Melbourne, and I had the good fortune of being able to interview a lot of senior civil servants in Australia, quite a few former cabinet ministers, including one prime minister. I interviewed Kevin Rudd, and was able to piece together why, in contrast to British Columbia, Australia had gone through what I describe as a roller coaster ride, or yo-yo politics, down and repeal and replace and legislate and erase, a suite of efforts to get a price established on carbon emissions in Australia. And it was a fascinating story. And I had intended only to write 1 chapter on it. It ended up being 3 chapters because it's such a rich political history. But more than that, it provides a rather remarkable contrast to British Columbia. And so that got into the book. It's a roughly a quarter or a third of the book, I suppose. And it provides a kind of a sounding board against which we can measure the success we enjoyed here in Canada, at least in British Columbia, and actually on the federal stage now, against failure elsewhere. I like to describe it as a chalk and cheese contrast. So that more or less brings us up to date. It took me a long time to complete the book because I kept adding little pieces to it and historical periods in British Columbia politics in particular. And then finally I said, okay, it's time to just try and get this out there. Now, meanwhile, in the last couple of years, of course, that political hot potato has emerged, and that's something that I would not have anticipated, but here we are.
All of these points that you bring up are, as you say, extremely important, and we're going to cover a lot of them today, or at least in some detail. But I think the most important place to start, because it is such a hot potato, as you were describing it, I think it might be useful to do the classic thing of just defining our terms. So when we talk about the carbon tax question, because there's a lot of information or perhaps misinformation out there, what exactly is the carbon tax as you discuss it? And yeah, we'll start there. Then we'll elaborate on that. But what exactly does it mean to instill a carbon tax?
A carbon tax is a straightforward mechanism to discriminate against the emissions of gases added to the atmosphere that are contributing to global warming. The most important gases contributing to global warming these days are carbon dioxide, which of course is a byproduct of combustion of all fossil fuels, and methane, which is a byproduct largely of the oil industry, the natural gas industry, and the processing of natural gas and so on. And so when we use the phrase carbon tax, what we're really referring to is essentially, you could say, carbon dioxide. We'll just put methane aside for a moment because it's not as important as carbon dioxide is. And so when we have something in society that we don't want to see, which is pollution, in this case, carbon dioxide pollution, which has taken the atmosphere from 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide to about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide today, relative to 1850. When we look at that remarkable change in the composition of the atmosphere that we are doing, and when we understand, as climate scientists understand implicitly, that carbon dioxide absorbs infrared radiation, heat, trying to leave the surface of the Earth from the sunlit surface of the Earth that's warm. We need to retain a balance so the heat gets back out into space. So infrared radiation heading towards space gets intercepted by that carbon dioxide that we have added to the atmosphere. And a fraction of it gets redirected right back at us. It's like we've wrapped the planet in a blanket. We've done that as a human society. It's something that is causing a lot of damage now to the planet, to ecosystems, to human societies, and to the insurance industry. I mean, we'll perhaps get into this, but in Canada alone in 2024, we have already had over $9 billion of insured claims due to extreme weather events which can be laid at the feet of global warming. And global warming is a function of carbon dioxide emissions primarily, and those carbon dioxide emissions are something we don't want. So let's discriminate against them. What's the best way we can do that? Well, we could pass regulations and say we're not going to burn fossil fuels anymore. Okay, that's an option. Is there a better option? Yes, there is a better option. Let's instead put a cost. Let's attach a cost to emitting those carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion, which will encourage changes in behavior. Because if you put a cost on something, people are going to try and avoid paying that cost. They'll find other ways to accomplish what they are trying to do. And then if you can add a really important characteristic to that tax or that cost, you can give them the money back. We call that revenue neutrality. So you pay on the pollution you're causing or pay for the pollution you're causing, but you get the money back. And if that money is going to come back regardless, then if you emit less carbon and you still get the money back, you have a really strong incentive to stop emitting while putting cash in your pocket. It's a beautiful system. And so that's what a carbon tax in its purest sense means when we put the phrase revenue neutral in front of it. Revenue neutral carbon tax is simply cycling a tax back into the economy to keep the economy healthy while discriminating against what we don't want. The simple mantra that has often been used by economists in this field is tax what you burn, not what you earn. And I think that kind of captures what we mean when we use the phrase carbon.
You brought up the phrase also revenue neutrality, which is attached to it. And it's funny because I rarely, at least here in Quebec, in my own neck of the woods, right, I rarely hear the term in its full, right? Revenue neutral carbon. But I think revenue neutrality is such a critical component to how this entire thing operates, right? Without the revenue neutrality, it's just burning money, like you're saying. So why do you think that is? Why do we think we tend to emphasize the carbon tax aspect of it, or at least in the way that we talk about it more generally in society? I feel like today we tend to emphasize the more carbon tax aspect of it, and rather than the revenue neutral aspect of it. And I'm curious if you have any idea why that might be. Is it because people are resistant to it, or because they're not necessarily informed about the full scope of it? I don't know if this question makes sense, but yeah.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And I think you just put your finger firmly on the pulse of what the issue really is. The two pieces to the phrase revenue neutral carbon tax are revenue neutral, those first two words, and carbon tax, the last two words. If you focus just on the last two, carbon tax, that's something that none of us really want to see. Why would any of us want to pay a tax just to drive to the supermarket or back?
More taxes.
That's not something that anyone wants. The word tax is not something that most of us embrace warmly. We pay them, yes, because a civil society requires taxes to be paid to run that society. But it's not something that we rush out to embrace. But put revenue neutral in front of it. And let's suppose that you emit some carbon, you pay tax on that, but you get the money back. Then is your objection to paying for that carbon tax, is your objection as strong? No, it's not as strong. If you know, and I want to emphasize that word know, if you know you're getting the money back, then you're not going to object to paying the tax. And particularly, if you know that by paying the tax, less carbon is going to be emitted and the atmosphere is going to be better as a consequence, and climate stability on the globe will be better as a consequence, then you're not going to object to paying that tax. What's happened, though, to answer your question about where we're going these days with that phrase carbon tax, is that some politicians, some of them are malfeasant politicians, they're not telling the truth. They'll focus on carbon tax and they'll call it a job-killing carbon tax or a price is going up for everything carbon tax. They will never tell you about the revenue neutrality part. They don't use that phrase. They don't use the word rebate or dividend or lower other tax rates as funded by the carbon tax. And so what the public tends to hear And this has been very heavily amplified by social media and by much of the mainstream media. They hear carbon tax incessantly. They don't hear revenue neutrality incessantly. And that's a real problem for communicating the whole benefit of the revenue neutral carbon tax of the type that we established in British Columbia.
Actually, let's get right into British Columbia in this case, because as you mentioned earlier, a huge part of your book focuses on British Columbia specifically and how it was essentially one of the first, if not the first, places to properly set up carbon tax as we know it today. So without obviously going into the entire depth that your book goes into, can you give listeners a brief history of how British Columbia came to adopt this particular policy? Because I think it's a really fascinating history that you alluded to earlier that goes back much further than I think people realize. It's only coming to the forefront now in public discourse, but this has been something that's been discussed since, if I remember your book correctly, at least the 80s, if not a little bit earlier. So can you take us through a brief history of where this idea comes from in the British Columbian context? And I'll have some other questions after that can maybe elaborate on that.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. There's one name really that's really critical, I think, to the carbon tax issue in British Columbia, and that's Gordon Campbell, who served as premier of the province from 2001 to 2011. But we need to start before 2001 when he became premier. And Gordon Campbell was mayor of Vancouver in the 1980s through 90s. And in 1988, there was a critically important meeting held in Toronto on the world climate system and on global warming. It was one of the early meetings on global warming. It preceded the Intergovernmental on Climate Change. It followed on from, or at least was almost simultaneous with Margaret Thatcher's concerns about growing global warming. And Margaret Thatcher actually was a hero in the global warming world because she recognized, as a scientist, which she was, she recognized that we were in real trouble, or starting to head toward real trouble if we didn't get a handle on carbon emissions. And so in 1988, 346 scientists got together in Toronto and for the first time explored the international or global scale repercussions that global warming would likely bring to the fore on planet Earth. That meeting was several days long. It issued a statement at the end, and I can read you the statement. And it was actually written, or at least the draft was written by Stephen Lewis at the time, who was present at the meeting. And he had been appointed Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in 1984. So here in 1988, Lewis's statement that was edited, of course, and accepted by all of the 40 countries that were present at the meeting. And here it is. Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war. Now, that's an incredibly powerful statement. Some said it's going over the top. But in fact, now, here in 2024, many years later, no, it's not going over the top. Just look at what's happening around the world. It's really extraordinary in terms of the insult that we have imposed on the Earth's climatic system. Well, Gordon Campbell was mayor of Vancouver at the time. He read that declaration. He took it seriously, and he commissioned a group of very smart people to take a look at what could be done just within the region of the city of Vancouver with respect to limiting the impact of global warming, and thus that required reducing carbon emissions. And they wrote a report that came out in 1990, that group. It was called Atmosphere of Change, and it explored what could be done regionally to lower carbon emissions. Now, this was a mayor of a major Canadian city, and in that report, they advocate for a carbon tax. It was in 1990, and they were pushing for a carbon tax in their report, regional scale, just in the city of Vancouver. So Gordon Campbell was a conservative. Now, even though he ran the BC Liberal Party in the years to come, that was our right of center party here in British Columbia. It certainly wasn't leftist. And so he had an early development of the importance of acting on this major environmental concern that was potentially threatening the long-term future of humanity. I mean, it's not going to threaten anybody my age particularly, although it's starting to now, I must admit. But back then, the implication was 100 years hence, we're going to be in real trouble. So Campbell was going to act on that. And so Yes, the history does go back some time, and other countries were starting to think about it at the same time. Australia was starting to consider what they were going to do. The economy is dramatically different from British Columbia's because most of their electrical energy was produced by burning coal. Ours is hydropower. So it's a totally different administration. But they were starting to recognize that Australia is very vulnerable to global warming, and we need to be starting to take this into account. And in fact, that was starting to sweep across the world. There was lots of discussion going on in Europe at the time and so on. And that brings us up toward where we were heading then with the later initiatives by Gordon Campbell once he became premier.
I do find this very interesting, and this relates back to one of the previous answers that you gave, which is to highlight that Campbell was not necessarily some radical progressive, right, in the ways that we would understand it today, right? As you're saying, he was right of center, classical liberal, if you will. And I think that's something that people often forget these days is that this started off as a market-based solution to the issue of climate change, which is a rather conservative idea. And I think that's a very insightful thing that your book highlights, right? That I've heard here and there, but I was glad to see it, mentioned in this text, and I think that it should be at least mentioned here in this conversation as well. And I'm curious, right, for a policy that was more on the conservative side as far as a solution to climate change, do you know when the shift happened from people who were more right of center endorsing a policy like this to perhaps being more antagonistic to it, as you might see today? I'm not throwing all conservatives under the bus in this case, but it does tend to be more resisted on that side of the political spectrum. Do you know when that shift happened towards being antagonistic towards a carbon tax, at least from the conservative side? I'm curious.
It's a fascinating question. I wouldn't know if that. I don't know if there was a shift that happened. I think there's always been different camps, if you like.
Okay.
One that says we don't want taxes, period, and very simplistic thinking that let's keep our tax burden low. And another camp that says, well, if we let a free market dictate the price of things, and if those things include detriments to society, like carbon emissions, then let's let the free market sort that out. So we don't have to focus so much on the aversion to taxation. We focus instead on the damage that a particular action like burning fossil fuels is having to the planet. And if you go back and look at the literature, the economics literature, going back to Milton Friedman's time or even before, so back into the 60s and so on, what you'll see is that there's a very strong streak in the conservative world. And Preston Manning is actually a very good proponent of this in Canada. There's a very strong streak that says, look, the root of conservative is conserve. And Preston Manning makes this point very clear. He's very much in favor of revenue neutral carbon taxation because he understands that what that does is, first of all, it allows a market or a tax system to recycle the dollars collected back into the economy, thus actually encouraging economic activity that is beneficial, at the same time as it discriminates against what we don't want, which is the pollution caused by carbon emissions. And all real conservatives, I like to say, even those at the Fraser Institute these days, I take Ross McKittrick, a well-known right-wing conservative economist at the University of Guelph. He would argue that revenue-neutral carbon pricing is the best possible mechanism to limit emissions of carbon dioxide. And he would now admit, he used to be a bit of a climate denier or a global warming denier 20 years ago, but now even Ross McKittrick says, okay, global warming is real, the science is clear, we have to get a handle on carbon emissions. The best way to do that is with a purely revenue-neutral carbon tax. Conservative economists, pretty much across the board, agree with that position. Now, why then are some economists going the other way? Well, those tend to be the ones that are trying to take political advantage. And I will point to one obvious one here in Canada at the present time, and that's the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, who insists that the carbon tax is damaging because he only looks at the expenditure side of the equation. He says that tax is being taken out of Canadians' pockets and they can't afford that. He never, ever addresses the fact that the money is coming back into those pockets. So what goes out of the right-hand pocket comes back into the left-hand pocket. And if you emit less carbon, less money is being taken out of your right-hand pocket, but it's still coming back into your left-hand pocket. So you're better off, and the atmosphere is better off, and the planet is better off. But he never tells you that full story. He does that, I'm convinced. I've never spoken to him. I don't think he would return my phone calls, frankly. But he does that because there's a real political advantage to it.
Exactly.
He's taking full advantage of the aversion that all of us have to the word tax. So by focusing solely on that word, he's gaining political popularity. And of course, his popularity has risen dramatically since he embarked on his Axe the Tax campaign.
We can come back to some of those specific points because I have also some particular examples in mind. But before we get too far from the inception of the carbon tax, you describe in your book British Columbia's carbon tax policy as a quote unquote template for the world, right? And I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that for listeners. Like, what were some of the key lessons that other regions of the world took from British Columbia's carbon tax policy? What fundamentally made it a template that could be imitated across the world, right? Or even within Canada?
That phrase, template for the world, I'll need to tell you this story before I get into the details of it. I'll need to tell you the story, where those words came from. In 2010, when I was directing the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, we brought to Victoria a very famous, eminent professor of economics named Paul Ekins. He's at the University College London. Magnificent man. He's the kind of individual who deals directly with Nobel Prize winners in economics, but at the same time can explain to a kindergarten class the basics of economics. He's a remarkable, remarkable teaching researcher, scholar. Paul came over because he had been appointed head of the Green Fiscal Commission in the United Kingdom by the Prime Minister of the day, Gordon Brown. And the Green Fiscal Commission was an all-party, very broad, kind of a citizens' assembly. It included industry, CEOs, House of Lords representatives, MPs from all parties in the UK, members, general members of society, unionists, etc., etc. It was a very broad group. And their task was to explore whether or not the United Kingdom could put increased taxation on carbon emissions and reduce taxation on employment. So it was a tax shift. They were challenged to come up with the bones, the skeleton of a tax shifting system that would discriminate against carbon emissions while encouraging employment and higher incomes or higher returns, higher paychecks in people's pockets. They issued a report in October of 2009, and any of your listeners would might welcome reading that report. It's 96 pages. It's Googleable. You can get it via Google. It's called Green Fiscal Reform, and it's a beautiful publication because it lays out how we can accomplish that particular endpoint of taxing carbon emissions, but putting money back in people's pockets. Essentially, it's pay as you burn, not as you earn. And they did a wonderful job of that. Well, Ekins wanted to learn more about what British Columbia was doing because our tax was already in place. So their report came out in the fall of 2009. On July 1st of 2008, our carbon tax had been proclaimed and took effect. So he came over. We brought him over, in fact. And I had him meet with academics and with politicians and editorial boards of the major newspapers and so on for 4 days. And he just soaked up all of the information he learned about what was happening in British Columbia. Our last meeting was with our cabinet minister who represented the Climate Action Program in British Columbia, a man named John Yap. And we met in Vancouver, and it was just the three of us, me and Paul Ekins and John Yap. We had a 30-minute meeting scheduled. It turned into about an hour because Yap was completely enamored by the brilliance of this economist from the United Kingdom. And at the end of the meeting, Paul Ekins leaned across the table to John Yap, the minister, and said, "Mr. Minister, I want you to know that your carbon tax is a template for the world." Well, you should have seen John Yap's face, because he was the front guy, the front man for representing the carbon tax in British Columbia. And he was getting hammered all the time by right-wing politicians, even from his own party, and from members of the public that saw the word tax but didn't see revenue neutrality. So he was getting hammered. To be told by one of the world's most eminent environmental economists that your policy was a template for the world was music to his ears that he'd not been told before. And of course, I'm sitting off to the side. I immediately wrote those words down. I thought, I've got to use those words somewhere in the future, because it's a perfect description for what we had done in British Columbia. So what did we do in British Columbia? Well, this gets to be a very long story, and I'm not sure where to start, but let me just zero right in on the tax itself, British Columbia's Carbon Tax Act. What the British Columbia Carbon Tax Act did was guaranteed that a price was going to be applied to most carbon emissions in British Columbia. It covered roughly 3/4 of our emissions. So gasoline consumption, diesel consumption, propane consumption, burning of shredded tires, burning of peat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long list of things. And at the same time, the tax that was going to be collected, which was set very modestly, initially at $10 Canadian per ton of CO2 emitted, which works out to a little over 2 cents on a liter of gasoline. And that was a number that wasn't chosen from any particular formula. When I asked Gordon Campbell why $10, he said, well, it seemed to be a kind of appropriate number. They really didn't have any good they didn't test it on
round number.
It was just a number that they thought would be okay. People are okay with 2 cents a liter on gasoline because the market was jumping gasoline prices up by 5, 10, 15, 20 cents over a course of a few weeks or a month all the time. So 2 cents wasn't seen to be onerous. So that tax started at $10 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and then it was to increase $5 per ton per year for 5 years. Why not 10 years, I asked him. He said, well, 5 years in politics is a pretty long time, but my intention, and I did not put this in the book, but my intention was always that it would continue on indefinitely into the future, that we would have a long upward ramp that would see the carbon price steadily increase. The compensation for members of the public or for all taxpayers, though, was that the money would come back to them. And here's how it was to come back to them. On January 1st of 2008, 6 months before the tax actually took effect, Campbell and his finance minister, Carol Taylor, lowered British Columbia's income tax rate for the bottom 2 strata of our income tax system. They lowered the corporate income tax rate starting later that year and then over stages to 2011. So it progressively went down from 12% to 10%. They lowered the small business rate of taxation on December 1st of 2008. Substantially, that rate fell by actually 29% relative to what small business had been paying. The consequence of those numbers or reductions was that everyone got the money back. And that was a requirement by law. The British Columbia Carbon Tax Act of 2008 requires by law that at least every penny of the carbon tax accepted by the government is returned to society via those other tax reductions and also via direct cash supports for low-income people. So today, in 2024, a family of 4 in British Columbia benefits from the carbon tax returns in 2 ways, from the revenue neutrality, if you like. First, that family of 4, if they have a family income, a declared taxable income of $57,288 or less, they get $1,008 in cash into their pocket, supported by the carbon tax. At the same time, they're also paying less income tax because those reductions that were put on the lowest 2 parts of the tax system, of the income tax system back in 2008, are still in place. And that's a significant number. I did a calculation recently, and
I'll take an extra $1,000.
Well, it's less than that actually,
No,
but
I know, but
for someone who has an income, if you have a taxable income in British Columbia of $91,309 in 2024, that's today, the income tax rates of 2008 are still in place. If we instead had used the income tax rates of 2007, before the carbon tax started to support the reductions, that taxpayer would be paying $343 more per year. So every taxpayer in Canada, in British Columbia right now, that's making around $91,000 or less, receives $200 to $350 worth of tax relief from the low income tax reductions of 2008 that are still in place and are still being supported by carbon tax revenue. That's revenue neutrality. And then there's a wonderful corollary attached to this. Because British Columbia announced to the world that they were going to put in place an actual carbon tax and make it revenue neutral, we were seen suddenly as a beacon for investment from the clean technology industries around the world. They took one look at British Columbia and said, wow, this is really smart. This is a place where we want to do business. And look, the corporate income tax just went down. Or if we're a small business, our tax rate just went down. And our employees will be paying less income tax. Why wouldn't we want to invest in British Columbia? And so they did. Investment flocked into BC. We had rapid growth in our clean technology sector, driven, if you talk to the experts in the field, driven to some significant degree by our Carbon Tax Act. It was a spur to economic development. And so the people at the time, the naysayers at the time said, carbon tax, oh my God, it's going to kill us. It'll kill the economy. In fact, the Canadian economy between 2008 and 2013 grew at least as fast as the Canadian economy, while our per capita carbon emissions fell 19% relative to the rest of Canada. So we killed two birds with one stone. We stimulated economic development, actually three birds with one stone. We stimulated economic development. We produced lower carbon emissions or encouraged lower carbon emissions. And we helped the world start to recognize that there is a way in which we can act on reducing the insult to the atmosphere that fossil fuel burning is.
Thank you so much for that history in this case. It does touch upon other questions that I had in mind, like the ancillary benefits, but this is really great stuff. And the way that you express this story, I can't help but wonder, were there any hurdles, right, whether political or social hurdles outside of the criticism from conservative economists, like you're saying, or some conservative economists, that were evident in British Columbia for the implementation of this carbon tax? You mentioned a few, but were there any significant other things stopping the implementation of this policy, or was it pretty much as smooth sailing as your story seems to suggest?
I don't think it would be fair to say it was smooth sailing. What I haven't remarked upon at all yet is what was happening in the back rooms. And there were a number of concerns there. First of all, we had a very smart Minister of Finance back then, a woman named Carol Taylor. And when Gordon Campbell announced essentially to his caucus that we needed to do something about the global warming challenge, and the best way to do that is to take the free market taxation approach, and revenue neutrality had to be key to that. So he essentially announced that to his caucus without asking their advice. It was almost autocratic leadership in that sense, in that he said, we're just going to do this. Now, he did have hurdles within his own cabinet and certainly within the broader caucus. He had a number of members of the legislature who did not believe in global warming back then. They were behind the curve, I suppose, in their capacity to understand the basic climate physics. And so he had to deal with those, but he simply just brushed them away because Campbell was a very smart man, very well read. He read a number of books about the global warming challenge, including The Weathermakers by Tim Flannery, Red Sky and Morning by James Gustav Speth at Yale, Heat by George Monbiot, and many others. He reads voraciously, or read voraciously in those days. He was described by one of my insiders, who was often in the cabinet room with him, described him as always the smartest man in the room and always the best prepared man in the room. And so when you have a leader who is willing to do the hard work and take the hard positions of saying to some of his fellow cabinet ministers, you're out of line and we're going to do this, and I'm the leader, and this is the right thing to do, and it's the right way to do it, and we're going to do it this way. They had no choice really but to accept that. It wasn't smooth entirely for him. Then the second piece is that you had to convince the business community that this was not going to harm them. All they saw was, of course, the word tax. They didn't understand what revenue neutrality meant. And that was a challenge in its own right for the government to educate people about what they meant by revenue neutrality. That remains a challenge today, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was even a challenge then. And so when the tax actually got proclaimed, the very first meeting that Carol Taylor, the finance minister, had, pretty much the day after she had announced the carbon tax in the budget speech of 2008, she had a meeting with the business community, led by British Columbia Association of Business Leaders or something like that.
Okay.
And these were the kind of CEOs and business giants in the province. And she went into the room and she kind of expected she might get a hostile reception, but they listened to her. And afterward, the chief economist for the association, a fellow named Jock Finlayson, came up to her and said, this is going to work. I can see that this will work. And she didn't hesitate to make her first meeting with the business community to go in and say, look, this is what's going to happen. Get ready for it, but here's how you're going to benefit. And she explained what revenue neutrality meant for them, and that their corporate income tax rate was going to go down and the small business tax rate was going to go down, funded by the carbon tax. And so how could they complain if the money was going to come back or if their other tax rates were going to come down? So that was an issue. The third issue, kind of a hurdle, if you like, was that you cannot announce or even hint that you're going to bring in a new tax, especially a broad spectrum tax, without disrupting the markets. The stock market is very sensitive to these sorts of things. And the forest industry, British Columbia, of course, is a big player here. And, you know, the stocks of the major players in the forest industry here in British Columbia were sensitive to what taxation rates might be and so on and so forth. So Carol Taylor worked for 1 year prior to the announcement of the carbon tax. From December 2007 through to January of 2008, she worked with a tiny group of about 8 people in the Department of Finance in secret. In secret. They were not allowed to release a single word of what they were doing. They weren't allowed to talk to their spouses about what they were doing. And in fact, the entire British Columbia Liberal caucus, Gordon Campbell's caucus, did not know that a carbon tax was going to be legislated until they heard it the day of the budget speech in 2008. They were kept completely out of the loop. And Carol Taylor told me that she said we had to do that. She said if we had told the caucus what our plans were, somebody would have leaked it and the markets would have gone nuts, and we couldn't have that. And so the first time that the caucus members and British Columbia society heard about the carbon tax was on February 18th of 2008, when Carol Taylor stood up in the legislature and announced it. And as I've said in the book, she gave that speech wearing green shoes. She very carefully chose those shoes. I asked her about that, and she said, oh yes, she said, I was very careful in my choice of color of those shoes.
You have to match the message.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me as I was reading the sections on Campbell, and as you were talking just now, this seems to be a perfect example of what people are often clamoring for in contemporary climate debates, which is to say, not always effective, but decisive leadership, right? Vis-a-vis these seemingly daunting issues that we're facing, that go much wider than carbon. Obviously, it's a major one, but so much larger. It's so much larger than carbon as well. And I think, Campbell is a perfect example of this decisive leadership that was willing to make, calls that he had no idea whether or not they were going to work, or the government that he was operating under had no idea sometimes if they were going to work as well as they thought they were going to be. So I do appreciate both your story and just that moment for giving an example of decisive leadership, politically speaking, which many people, right or wrong, feel that we're lacking. I don't know if that's fair to say. Maybe you disagree with me on that, but I do see it as a...
That's fair to say. There certainly was decisiveness on Campbell, no argument, and being the smartest guy in the room and understanding
Exactly.
well. And he took advice from climate scientists and others. And also he had shopped around ideas, carbon tax being just one of maybe a dozen different ideas that he had shopped around to the business community just to get their opinions. And so he had a lot of feedback as to where the quicksand might be in front of him with respect to how they were going to address the climate challenge. So he did his homework for sure. But no, the decisiveness was absolutely key. There are some other key considerations, though, I think that are really important in the overall structure of the carbon tax. First of all, Carroll Taylor insisted that everybody was going to be paying the tax one way or another. Therefore, everybody had to benefit. And that's an equation that has a big equal sign in front of it, really right in the middle of it. It was really an important consideration. Her primary concern there, of course, was that low-income families and poor British Columbians could get hit disproportionately hard by this tax. And that's why she brought in the cash subventions, the cash in your pocket program for low-income British Columbians. And in fact, they very carefully modeled the impact of the carbon tax on all strata, economic strata within society. And so the number that they settled on for the level of cash support to low-income people was the result of extensive modeling analyses. And they set that number higher than what their expected outlay on the tax would be, so that they would be net beneficiaries, not by a large amount, but not out of pocket. And Carroll Taylor's innate sense of social concern, if you like, or social equity dictated that. So I think that's an important piece. The other piece that I would signal here is that Gordon Campbell insisted that the tax had to apply across the board. There would be no free riders. They weren't going to carve out exceptions for anybody. And the rationale for that was that why would we carve out an exception since we're lowering other tax rates that they would pay? And therefore, there's no reason for us to carve out exceptions. And in fact, one of the points that he had in terms of feedback from the business community was that if there was going to be some sort of price put on carbon emissions, the business community wanted no free riders. We're all going to be in this same boat. Let's just make sure that the playing field is as level as it can be and let the cards lie beyond that.
To this point, which you raised more towards the beginning of our talk, a major part of your book is also a comparison with Australia, right, which you qualified at the beginning of our discussion as perceived more of a failure, right, their experiment with carbon tax. So can you explain a little bit why you would qualify it as that? Like, what were the circumstances that made their implementation of a carbon tax different than what we see in British Columbia, and why it would not have necessarily gone, to again come back to this particular term, as smoothly as would have been intended?
Yes, I look at Australia as an example of a country that would have done really well to have simply taken what British Columbia did and apply it to Australia.
Right.
But Australia has some unique features to it that we don't have in British Columbia, and that essentially forced them to take a different route. The biggest difference is that here in British Columbia, we have hydropower to supply our electricity. So roughly 92% of our electricity here in British Columbia is produced by essentially rainfall falling on the province and going through our dams. In Australia, most of it used to be, 20 years ago, most of their electricity was being generated by burning coal. And if you're in a coal burning country that your electricity supply depends on, and you're talking about carbon emissions and taxing those, then really what you're talking about is the price of electricity. And so that was a huge barrier toward how they might structure a carbon pricing system in Australia. And so they chose different routes over time, and the routes go back to, I guess they first started in the 1980s. In terms of environmental awareness, the prime minister of the day from 83 to 91 was a fellow named Bob Hawke. You might remember him. He was, well, you're young yet, but you might remember him. He was a labor leader, a former unionist, a very good prime minister, and he was aware of the emerging environmental consciousness in the world. He was aware of the potential impact of global warming on Australia, which is the world's driest continent, in fact, and had the prospect of getting even drier as the wind systems changed and as temperatures rose. And then, of course, in 1988, when that Toronto meeting was held and the declaration that Stephen Lewis wrote was well publicized, Hawke took notice of that. And so in 1990, he produced a rather important document about the environmental future of Australia that caused quite a stir. There was no talk then of putting a price on carbon emissions, but certainly consideration was in place for starting to think about how Australia was going to take more in an environmentally responsible kind of position. And at that time, too, well, around that time, Australia started to get really upset about clear-cut forests in Queensland and Tasmania. And so the public conscience was sort of being tweaked by clear-cutting, and that was also happening in British Columbia at the same time. We had our war in the woods, as it was called, in the early 90s, and Australia was going through, as I said, about the same time. There's some interesting parallels there. And so people started to think, citizens in both British Columbia and Australia were starting to think about the environment, taking it more seriously than they had prior to that. But nothing was yet happening on the carbon pricing front. Then John Howard, who was a right-wing prime minister, took over from one of Bob Hawke's predecessors. There's a whole suite of prime ministers here. But John Howard took over from 1996 to 2007. And the Kyoto Conference was held in 1997, that many of us will remember. And that led to all kinds of teeth gnashing in Australia, because clearly the world was moving toward limiting carbon emissions. And here's Australia producing its electricity from burning coal. And it was also one of the world's largest coal exporters. And its economy was very largely rooted, to some fraction of its economy was very strongly rooted in the exploitation and consumption and combustion of coal, as well as its export. And here was Kyoto, the world getting together in Kyoto saying we're going to have to start limiting emissions. And Australia was getting very worried about this. And so again, it got elevated in terms of the national discussion. And then Howard got defeated by Kevin Rudd, who became prime minister in 2007. And Rudd campaigned in part on reducing carbon emissions. And at that point, Howard was being seen as a dinosaur. And he really had no sense of how Australia could start to move toward reducing carbon emissions, other than he was willing to subsidize industry to pay for technologies that would lower carbon combustion. But the taxpayer was going to pay for that. And that didn't wash very well. People were saying, what? You know, you're going to take money out of my pocket so that coal power plant down the road can put a scrubber on its stack, and I'm going to pay for that? They should pay for that. And so that was a pretty fractious issue in Australia, and Howard's policies at the time were not being well taken. Kevin Rudd came along and said, we're going to do what's happening elsewhere in the world, in Europe in particular, and I'm going to establish a carbon market. It'll be a cap and trade market where we will limit emissions, and the large emitters will have to buy credits to emit. We'll initially give them a whole bunch of credits to start with for free. But after that, as the emissions are required year by year to ratchet down a little bit, if they don't meet those lower emissions targets, are going to have to buy credits on a market. That was called the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, or CPRS. And Kevin Rudd tried to get that passed. And in fact, he ran into all kinds of political problems with it. not so much within his own Labour Party, but surprisingly, Australia is bicameral, and like Canada is, Australia has an elected Senate. We have an appointed Senate, but Australia has an elected Senate as well as a House of Representatives. And as it turns out, when the carbon pollution reduction scheme was put before the Senate, it failed. It did not pass. It passed in the House, didn't pass in the Senate. And the reason it didn't pass in the Senate is wrapped in irony. The Green Party voted against it. 5 Green members voted against it because it didn't go far enough. It wasn't strong enough in their mind. It wasn't pure enough. And so it failed to pass the Senate. And Kevin Rudd struck out on that. And, the Green Party ruse that today in Australia. Perfection is the enemy of the good. And this is a classic example of that. It didn't go far enough. So Kevin Rudd got eventually replaced by Julia Gillard. She took over as Prime Minister, and they have this peculiar parliamentary system in Australia whereby any sitting member of any party can challenge for the leadership of the party just by calling a vote. We don't have that in Canada, although I think the Conservatives, Aaron O'Toole may have lost because someone challenged.
Something similar, yeah.
But in Australia, it happens far too often. At least in the last 20 years, there have been multiple such challenges. They call them spills. That's the word they use, and I put a footnote in the book to explain what a spill is. But so Julia Gillard challenged Kevin Rudd for the leadership, and she won. She won that spill vote in 2010 and became Australia's first female prime minister as a result of it. She wasn't elected as prime minister originally. She just challenged Rudd. His popularity had been sagging, in particular because of the debacle with the whole pricing system for carbon. She took over, and she brought in a different law, again, recognizing that they had to do something to limit carbon emissions. It was called the Clean Energy Bill, which was an emissions trading scheme, again, a kind of a cap and trade carbon market system. And she got that passed in 2011. This time, the Greens were a little bit smarter. They'd learned the first time that they couldn't push as hard as they wanted to push without losing the whole
bit of compromise is necessary here.
So they were able to get it through, and so Julia Gillard in 2011 got the Clean Energy Bill passed, and that established an emissions trading system. And immediately, within months, it started to have a positive impact. Employment went up, particularly on the clean technology side. Carbon emissions from the brown coal sector, the dirty, cheap, poor carbon quality or poor heating quality coal, those emissions started to fall. They went down relatively dramatically quickly because there was all of a sudden a price on burning that coal. It increased the adoption of solar photovoltaic systems, particularly on domestic roofs and so on and so forth. And so the country switched gears relatively quickly toward starting to lower the carbon emissions, maintaining economic impact, and it was all focused largely on these large emitters. The individuals were not necessarily targeted at all for taxes because there were no taxes specifically on an individual consumption. However, electricity prices went up because renewables and other sources other than coal, other than cheap coal, had to be used to generate electricity. And so electricity bills went up. Julia Gillard had recognized that was going to happen. And so to compensate taxpayers, what she did is took the tax exemption that we all enjoy in Canada. In Australia, it was $6,000 per year of income was your initial exemption from income tax. So up to $6,000, you paid no income tax. She trebled that. She changed it from $6,000 to $18,000. That's Australian dollars, which is about the same as Canadian.
Yeah.
Just overnight, as part of the whole carbon emissions program. And so that suddenly poor Australians that had been paying income tax between 6,000 Australian and 18,000 Australian, they were paying tax on that. Suddenly they weren't paying that tax anymore. So they had cash in their pocket. And that was designed to pay for their increased electricity bills, plus give them a little extra. So it was, in a sense, a socially equitable system that she set up. The focus very much being on coal combustion in the electricity generating industry. Just about everything else in the country was insignificant compared to that behemoth, that massive amount of coal that was being combusted all the time to produce electricity. And then Tony Abbott won the election in 2013. Hard right-winger. Mm-hmm. He had a history of denying global warming, although he was skilled enough as a politician never to be very implicit in how he denied global warming. And today he would say, well, he never really denied it. He just didn't want to have to act on it and so on. He scuttles around that. But anyway, Tony Abbott took power in 2013, and shortly thereafterward, he repealed Julia Gillard's carbon pricing system. And so Australia finds itself still in a pickle today. Having said that, the momentum that the renewable energy industry has established in Australia is unstoppable now. It's unstoppable. And so it's moving ahead regardless. And coal is a dying fuel in terms of electricity reduction. And so it is on its way out, but it doesn't have the impetus that it had when Julia Gillard had her emissions trading system.
Absolutely.
So the parallels between Australia and British Columbia are, well, they're not particularly parallel, in fact, because of the different way in which we use and produce energy. But the good news is that Australia did the experiment. They showed that carbon pricing actually worked. It got the renewables energy kind of kickstarted. That's going apace now. It's better news for the future. They're still burning too much coal, but they recognize that that's an issue. It's a challenge that they will need to deal with relatively soon, one hope. And meanwhile, in British Columbia, we've gone through a different suite of changes after Gordon Campbell left as leader. And then, of course, we can start to go on the federal stage at some point.
The examples, just to create another parallel that you were bringing up, both examples of British Columbia and Australia in their successes demonstrate what is often seen as a criticism of the carbon tax policy, which is to say that it's going to hurt local and resource-dependent regions, right? One of the major criticisms that you hear out in the prairies is that it's going to affect them because they're very oil-reliant, parts of the world. I know here in Quebec, again, just to an example that I've heard from family members who are farmers, that they're going to be heavily impacted by this. But as the examples that you gave demonstrated, there is an impact, but it's not necessarily a negative impact all across the board for these more resource-dependent regions that you see in Australia or British Columbia. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, but I do think that it is a good example in that sense.
I think that's a really good point you raised. Certainly, we have to recognize that coal is yesterday's fuel.
Yes.
So coal mining is something that's going to disappear from the planet over the next coming decades. How fast that happens remains to be seen, but it's happened remarkably quickly in places like the United States, where it's disappearing very quickly. It's pretty much entirely disappeared from the United Kingdom. We don't see economies collapse as a result of it. We do, however, see coal miners being unemployed.
Yes. We
need to take that very much into account. We can't just abandon those people.
Absolutely.
And so there's a whole suite of steps can be taken to do that. And of course, retraining is part of it. Supporting them directly is part of it. The American billionaire Mark Cuban just last week, suggested that it would cost $36 billion in the United States to buy up all existing coal mines and shut them down. $36 billion.
In the grand scheme of things is nothing.
Change. Yeah. But included in his $36 billion was paying a pension to the coal miners in those companies for the rest of their lives, for $36 billion. Now, I haven't checked his calculations. I don't know what the basis was. I presume he's smart enough to not put a false number out there. But that struck me as a very interesting consideration, that a smart administration, which they don't have at the present time, but a smart administration might want to consider adopting.
So,
in any event, coal is yesterday's fuel. Oil is en route to becoming yesterday's fuel. It's now 2024. By the middle of this century, it's unlikely that we're going to see much more demand for oil. And in fact, the energy, what's it called? It doesn't matter what the name of the outfit is. One of the major energy analysis organizations in the world has suggested that by 2030, gasoline demand will peak and will diminish afterward. It's already peaking in Canada. We are seeing electric vehicles taking over in a fairly significant way, and at least here in British Columbia, roughly 1 in 5 new car sales is now all electric, a battery-powered vehicle. In Norway, it's now 92% of all new car sales are 100% electric. And the interesting thing is that this is not straining the Norwegian electrical grid, as they are well intertwined outside the country, and so that electricity is coming from different sources at different times of the day, and renewables are making a big contribution to that, in addition to their inherent hydro. And so these things could all be accomplished. I think one has to think, go back to the days of horse and buggy. And when the automobile came along, the horse and buggy industry collapsed. It took 3 decades from, roughly 1895 through to 1920-ish or so for the full transition to take place. But when you look back, the man who founded General Motors actually was a buggy manufacturer. And when he saw, it was Will Dumont was his name, I may have the name wrong, but when he foresaw what was happening with the advent of the automobile, he switched and he started to manufacture cars instead of buggies. Well, anyone now who's looking at the coal industry is recognizing that as a dead industry. You're not going to pursue that anymore. If you're looking at investing in the oil industry, where would you invest today? Well, you certainly would not want to make a long-term investment on the scale of decades, because it's an industry that eventually is going to fade away. The only demand for oil in the future, the primary demand, will be asphalt for road building, and natural gas and other compounds for plastics making. But in terms of powering internally combustion vehicles, engines, those internal combustion engines are slowly going to disappear, and there won't be a demand for that product. That's just simply what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but we do need to put in place steps that will remove the pain element from that transition, particularly for the workers involved.
The last question I have, it kind of fits in with what you were just saying, which is kind of projecting ourselves in the future here. So we've talked mostly here about the current state of carbon taxing and as well as its history. I'm wondering, where do you see this policy going in the future? Do you see it adapting properly to the oncoming changes, especially for a policy that you see as being the most consequential, to come back to the title of your book, right? Or if we maintain it as it is, does it risk kind of falling short of what the Earth needs, right? Because obviously carbon is one element of climate change, but where do you see this going in the next years?
I'm very worried, frankly, very worried because of the politics that we're seeing in various parts of the world at the moment, certainly here in Canada, and now in the United States with the Donald Trump administration taking shape. I think that's going to be, it's going to set us back by a number of years. And so let's focus on Canada first. It looks, based on poll results, Mr. Poilievre is leading quite substantially in the polls, and the odds, I think, favor him becoming the next prime minister along with his party. If he follows through on axing the federal Canadian consumer fuel charge, or most of us would see that as the carbon tax, that will set us back. It will certainly set us back in terms of encouraging clean technology industry and innovation. It will set us way back in terms of our emissions profile as one of the community of nations on the planet. We will lose ground relative to where we should be going, which is reducing. And what that means, of course, is that we will be encouraging further damage to the planet through global. The impacts of that damage are something we haven't really spoken about yet. But it's really critical to recognize that if we don't get a handle on global warming, we are going to have increasing difficulty to pursue, for example, agriculture in the heartland of Canada. The prairies have, over history, undergone periods of drought, but all of the computer models of the future on a warmer planet suggest that we're going to start seeing episodes of extreme drought in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. That has economic impacts and social impacts which are entirely negative for Canada. We have to take into account the fact that sea level is rising, and Canada has the world's longest coastline. And sea level is rising, and it's starting to rise pretty dramatically. It's up about 20 centimeters from where it was in the year 1900. And by the end of this century, it might be up something on the order of 1 meter relative to late 1800. And so you look at a province like Prince Edward Island, it's going to have a real struggle in the future with those higher sea levels. I look at the lower mainland of British Columbia. I used to live in Richmond years ago, where Vancouver Airport is. Just 2 nights ago on the national news was a story about raising dikes around YVR, Vancouver Airport, at great cost because of sea level rise. So not acting on global warming comes with a big price tag. Acting on global warming by putting in place revenue neutral carbon pricing doesn't come with a price tag, and it helps to lower emissions. And we showed that in British Columbia. It works. So a combination of a revenue neutral carbon tax plus a suite of regulations for things that we should be doing, like improving our building quality, for example, for energy efficiency buildings. Those sorts of things need to be done, and they need to be done proactively, and they need to be done 20 years ago. But we'll accept tomorrow, because that's all we've got to play with now. If we turn our back on this, which Pierre Poilievre is intent to do, we're going to be in real trouble, I think, economically, socially, environmentally. And then the other piece of this, I think, is really important, is to recognize that, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, extreme weather events driven by global warming this year alone have already cost us in excess of $9 billion in insured claims. And any of your listeners who pays for household insurance will know that their bill for household insurance has gone up dramatically over the last several years. My own bill has doubled in the last 6 years.
Absolutely.
For basic house insurance. Why is that? It's because of overland flooding to a large degree, which is happening with remarkable increase in frequency now, again, because of global warming. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. When warm, moist air hits a cold front, that water vapor condenses and it comes down in narrow bands of rain, which are torrential. And, there are multiple examples of this, just multiple. They number in the tens of examples this year alone of torrential floods around the world. Valencia being a classic one that got a lot of media coverage here last month. They had 491 millimeters of rain. So think a half a meter of rain in 8 hours. 8 hours. And so no infrastructural system that we have for drainage in any Canadian city or any city anywhere in the world can handle that sort of deluge. And so as a consequence, our personal insurance rates for household insurance are going up. That's a cost, and it's a cost that we can lay at the feet of global warming. And so it's irresponsible for any leader in Canada these days to say we're going to axe the tax, because British Columbia showed that a revenue neutral carbon tax lowers emissions, generates economic activity, and everybody is better off as a consequence.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful place to end. Thomas, sorry, I was going to call you something else. Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. This was really a fascinating conversation, and I cannot recommend this book enough for listeners who might be interested either in knowing more about the history of the carbon tax or just arming themselves with arguments as to why it works. I cannot stress this enough. It is really, I think it's going to be an invaluable resource for future Canadians. But if you have anything that you want to promote, either ways that people can contact you or other projects that you're working on, is there anything that you want to end on for the listener?
Well, they can certainly contact me through the publisher, Harbor Publishing. Just send them a note and that will get relayed to me. I will point out that the book is available nationwide. It's in bookstores everywhere, as far as I know, everywhere. And it can also, of course, be ordered online from a number of sites. So it's stocked by all of the major bookstores and it's online. My only hope about the book is that it will raise the level of discussion about this absolutely critical tool that we have in our toolbox to deal with the fundamentally serious issue of global warming. We need to blunt the curve of the growth of carbon, heat-absorbing compounds, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, in Earth's atmosphere, if we are to save ourselves a rather miserable future. So we need to get there, and I guess I'm the eternal optimist. I think we can get there, but we need really smart, wise, informed, visionary leadership. We saw that with Gordon Campbell on this particular file. We're not seeing it right now from the leader of the opposition in Canada. I think Justin Trudeau did a very good job, actually, in 2018 in bringing in the Canadian carbon pricing system that did, which is patterned largely on British Columbia's experience. It's a working system. It works well. It's always difficult in a patchwork country like the Confederation of Canada represents, but I think they did a very good job of that. They have not defended it very well. They have not communicated it very well. Those remain deficiencies that they need to get out there and do a better job on. But overall, it's a pretty good program. But as a society, we need to act on this challenge in front of us. And right now, I'm not confident that we're going to be acting in the right way in the near future.
As you said, it is important to have at least a little bit of hope for the future, because otherwise, what's the point?
Yes, never give up hope. Yes, we just need to keep the pressure on and keep the level of discussion constructive, not destructive. It doesn't help to call our carbon tax a job-killing carbon tax national. It's not. That's a falsity. It doesn't get us anywhere toward solving the challenge, the existential challenge of global warming. And that's where we need to be focusing our attention.
Well, again, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. And yeah, I look forward to any other projects that you put out.
Thank you very much.